Good morning, everyone. Today we will discuss about ethics and pure reason, the legacy of the Greek philosophers. So, some of the philosophers mentioned in this book is Socrates. Socrates was an ancient Greek philosopher considered to be the main source of Western thought. He was condemned to death for his Socratic method of questioning. Socrates was a scholar, teacher, and philosopher born in ancient Greece. His Socratic method laid the groundwork for Western systems of logic and philosophy. When the political climate of Greece turned against him, Socrates was sentenced to death by hemlock poisoning in 399 BC. He accepted this judgment rather than fleeing into exile. The second philosopher is Plato. Plato is an Athenian Greek philosopher. Plato founded the Academy and is the author of philosophical works of unparalleled influence in Western thought. Born in circa 428 BCE, ancient Greek philosopher Plato was a student of Socrates and a teacher of Aristotle. His writings explored justice, beauty, and equality, and also contain discussions in aesthetics, political philosophy, theology, cosmology, epistemology, and the philosophy of language. Plato founded the Academy in Athens, one of the first institutions of higher learning in Western world. He died in circa 348 BCE. The third philosopher is Aristotle. Ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, together with Socrates and Plato, laid much of the groundwork for Western philosophy. Aristotle, 348 BC to 302 BC, was an ancient Greek philosopher and scientist who is still considered one of the greatest thinkers in politics, psychology, and ethics. When Aristotle turned 17, he enrolled in Plato's Academy. In 338, he began tutoring Alexander the Great. In 335, Aristotle founded his own school, the Lyceum, in Athens, where he spent most of the rest of his life studying, teaching, and writing. Some of his most notable works include Nicomachean Ethics, Politics, Metaphysics, Poetics, and Prior Analytics. The last philosopher mentioned in this report is Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher during the Enlightenment era of the late 18th century. His best-known work is The Critique of Pure Reason. Immanuel Kant was born on April 22, 1724, in Königsberg, Prussia, or what is now Kaliningrad, Russia. While tutoring, he published science papers including General Natural History and Theory of the Heavens in 1755. He spent the next 15 years as a metaphysics lecturer. In 1781, he published the first part of Critique of Pure Reason. He published more critiques in the years preceding his death on February 12, 1804, in the city of his birth. So in this chapter, we will examine the first of the three views just mentioned, which is the group 1. States that the moral statements originate through a process of reason or logic. In this view, all who are trained in the application of logic must necessarily arrive at the same conclusion about ethical matters. Those in this group agree that moral principles are absolute, for logically derived principles do not change with majority opinion from one place or time to another, as logic itself is immutable. This was the position of certain Greek philosophers including Plato and Aristotle. Plato held that the goal of the rational person was the cultivation of personal virtue or excellence and happiness. In his view, such a person knows what is true rather, by pure reason, can control his desires, and is capable of both philosophy and command. Some of the virtues Plato had put forward were temperance, courage, wisdom, and justice. Aristotle, on the other hand, emphasizes those of friendship, pride, and moderation. Meaning, sa chapter na to, let's define what is moral first. Moral is right, knowing what is right from wrong. So they deduce their definition of morality by pure logic itself o by human reasoning. Diyan nila na-generate ang kanilang morality. So issues of right and wrong in ordinary life were in a different and much lesser category than the pursuit of philosophical influence. So para sa kanila, ang issue ng morality or ang right and wrong is only for the common people or para lang sa mga mababawang nila lang. Pero, kung ikaw naman ay nagpupursue ng philosophical excellence, you were on a higher category. Here is a clear separation between common morals, which anyone could understand and apply, and the ethics of virtue, to which only deep thinker could truly aspire. So they assume that the common people would have common morals because of the right and wrong, but only those who are deep thinker will only achieve or will only deduce these ethics of virtue. So these principles might be summarized in this way. Goodness refers to virtue and rightness to action. Another illustration of the difference between modern Western ideas and the ideas of some of the ancients can be found in Plato's concept of justice. So what is this justice? This view is just person must fulfill his or her proper role in state. No? Maybe he or she is a ruler, administrator, or a citizen. So the concept of justice of Plato is one person must fulfill his proper role o ang kanyang katayuan sa isang lugar. Each person has a natural position of control or subordination, and any perversion of this is an injustice. No one should ever seek to act outside their just station in life. No, meaning, kung ang katayuan mo ay isang ruler or isa ka lang common na citizen, hindi ka pwedeng makialam sa ibang buhay ng may buhay. To propose, therefore, that the same laws should apply to both commoner and king would be illogical. In an ethics based on reason, moral laws are supposed to exist apart from convention, culture, or decree. They do not change with time or civilization. They simply are. So meaning, once na ikaw ay nagpupursue ng ethics and moral, meaning you are on a higher category, and that deduced moral by pure reasoning is hindi siya change ng culture or ng decree or ng time. No? It is simply just the way it is. Socrates, according to Plato, held that a person who once knew what was good could not choose to do evil and therefore the acquisition of knowledge through philosophy was sufficient to attain all virtue. Socrates believed that philosophy should achieve practical results for greater well-being of society. He attempted to establish an ethical system based on human reason rather than theological doctrine. Socrates pointed out that human choice was motivated by the desire for happiness. So another philosopher came in the late 18th century, which is Immanuel Kant. These traditional absolutist views were virtually unchallenged. Kant reformulated them in terms of a law of duty. So now the morals is the law of duty, which, not love, which is an emotion that he called the categorical imperative. Briefly stated, it is this: whatever one does, one must act in a manner that is consistent with wanting that action to become a universal law. The corollary to this is that people are to be treated as ends, not as means to an end. Meaning, kung ano ang gusto mong gawin or ano ang talagang gusto mong ma-achieve, you must do it for the society or for the better goods of all. No? Become universal law. The corollary to this is that people are to be treated as an ends, not as a means to an end. Meaning, you don't use people for yourself or para sa iyong self-interest, but you use people for the advancement of the society.
Kant took morality pretty seriously, and he thought we should too, all of us, regardless of our religious beliefs or lack thereof. Because he knew that if we look to religion for our morality, we're not all going to get the same answer. But he thought morality was a constant in an almost mathematical sense. 2 + 2 = 4, whether you're a Christian, Buddhist, or atheist, and for Kant, the same went for moral truths. But he made a distinction between the things we ought to do morally and the things we ought to do for other non-moral reasons. He pointed out that most of the time, whether or not we ought to do something isn't really a moral choice. Instead, it's just contingent on our desires. Like, if your desire is to get money, then you ought to get a job. If your desire is to get an A in class, then you ought to study. Kant called these if-then statements hypothetical imperatives. They're commands that you should follow if you want something. But hypothetical imperatives are about prudence rather than morality. So if you don't want money, you can always choose not to work. And if you don't care about getting a good grade, studying becomes totally optional. It'd be a terrible option, in my opinion, as an educator, but still, optional. But Kant viewed morality not in terms of hypothetical imperatives, but through what he called categorical imperatives. These are commands you must follow regardless of your desires. Categorical imperatives are our moral obligations, and Kant believed that they're derived from pure reason. He said it doesn't matter whether you want to be moral or not. The moral law is binding on all of us. And he said you don't need religion to determine what that law is, because what's right and wrong is totally knowable just by using your intellect. Okay, so how do you figure out what's moral? Kant said the categorical imperative can be understood in terms of various formulations, basically different ways of phrasing or looking at the same essential idea. And he came up with 4 formulations of the categorical imperative. Let me tell you about the 2 most popular ones. The first formulation of the categorical imperative is often known as the universalizability principle. And Kant phrased it this way: act only according to that maxim, which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law without contradiction. Okay, Kant. Pretty wordy guy, so let's unpack what he was saying. A maxim is just a rule or principle of action, and a universal law is something that must always be done in similar situations. So, as a Kantian, before I act, I would ask myself, what's the maxim of my action? In other words, what's the general rule that stands behind the particular action I'm considering? Let's say you forgot your wallet in your dorm this morning. You don't have time to get it between classes, and you're really hungry. You notice that the student working at the snack kiosk in the Union is engrossed in a conversation, and you could easily easily snag a banana and be on your way. Sorry, chom-chom. I mean chom-chom. You could easily swipe that chom-chom and be on your way. Is it okay, morally, for you to do this? Well, the particular action you are considering, taking a chom-chom from a merchant without paying for it, is stealing. And if you approve of the maxim of stealing, which you're doing whether you admit it or not, then what you're actually doing is universalizing that action. You're saying that everyone should always steal. If you should be able to do it, then everyone should be able to do it. The thing is, this leads to a contradiction, and remember, Kant's wording specifically says that moral actions cannot bring about contradictions. The contradiction here is no one would say that everyone should steal all the time. Because if everyone should always steal, then you should steal the chom-chom, and then I should steal it back from you, and then you should steal it back from me, and it would never end, and no one would ever get to eat any chom-chom. Therefore, stealing isn't universalizable. So what Kant's really saying is that it's not fair to make exceptions for yourself. You don't really think stealing is okay, and by imagining what it would be like to universalize it, that becomes clear. Now, Kant's view that moral rules apply to everyone equally sounds nice and fair, but it can sometimes lead to some pretty counterintuitive results. To see how this formulation can go awry, let's visit the thought bubble for some flash philosophy. Let's say one morning Elvira and Tony are having breakfast. Then a stranger comes to the door and asks where Tony is so he can kill him. Obviously, Elvira's impulse is to lie and say that Tony isn't around right now in order to protect him from this would-be murderer. But Kant says she can't lie. Not ever. Not even to save Tony's life. Here's his reasoning. Suppose she's at the front door talking to the stranger. At the time, she thinks Tony's in the kitchen where she left him, but it turns out that he was curious about the caller, so he followed her into the living room and heard the stranger make his threats. Fearing for his life, Tony slipped out the back door. Meanwhile, Elvira, in her desire to save him, tells the stranger that Tony isn't there even though she thinks he is. Based on her lie, the stranger leaves and runs into Tony as he rounds the corner heading away from the house and kills him. Had she told the truth, the stranger might have headed into the kitchen looking for Tony, which would have given Tony time to escape. But she didn't. Now, by Kant's reasoning, Elvira is responsible for Tony's death because her lie caused it. Had she told the truth, only the murderer would have been responsible for any deaths that might have occurred. Now, she could have refused to answer the stranger altogether or tried to talk him out of it. But the one thing that she's never permitted to do is violate the moral law, even if others are doing so, even for a really good cause. Poor Tony. Very sad. But thanks, Thought Bubble. So the first formulation of the categorical imperative is about the universality of our actions. But the second formulation focuses on how we should treat other people. And it goes this way. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a mere means. Again, we have to define some terms here to figure out what this is all about. To use something as a mere means is to use it only for your own benefit with no thought to the interests or benefit of the thing you're using. Now, we use things as mere means all the time. I use this mug to hold my coffee, and if it were to stop benefiting me, like if it got a crack in it and it started leaking, I wouldn't use it anymore. It's perfectly fine to use things as mere means, but not humans. This is because we are what Kant called ends in ourselves. We are not mere objects that exist to be used by others. We are our own ends. We're rational and autonomous, and we have the ability to set our own goals and work toward them. Coffee mugs exist for coffee drinkers. Humans exist for themselves. So to treat someone as an end in herself means to recognize the humanity of the person you're encountering, to realize that she has goals, values, and interests of her own, and you must morally keep that in mind in your encounters with her. Now, Kant pointed out that we do use people all the time, and that's okay. Because most of the time we use other people as a means for something, but not as a mere means. We still recognize their humanity when we use them, and they agree to being used. So, for example, you are using me right now to get information about Kantian ethics. I am using Nick and Nicole to help me get that information to you. Kant said that you and I and Nick and Nicole, we all deserve to not be used as mere means because of our autonomy. Unlike other things in the world, we're self-governed. We're able to set our own ends, to make our own free decisions based on our rational wills. We can set goals for ourselves and take steps to realize those goals. This imbues us with an absolute moral worth, Kant said, which means that we shouldn't be manipulated or manipulate other autonomous agents for our own benefit. And this means that things like lying and deception are never okay, because if I'm being deceived, I can't make an autonomous decision about how to act because because my decision is based on false information. For instance, I might agree to loan you money so you can buy books for school, but I wouldn't agree to loan you money so that you can get a new Xbox. I'm sorry, but no. So when you lie to me about what you're going to be doing with the money you're asking for, you rob me of my ability to autonomously decide to help you. You've treated me as a mere means to accomplish your goals with no thought to my own goals and interests, and that's a violation of Kant's second categorical imperative. So, Kant argued that proper rational application of the categorical imperative will lead us to moral truth that is fixed and applicable to all moral agents. No God required. Of course, not everyone agreed with him, so next time we're going to check out a theory that is in many ways the antithesis of Kantianism: utilitarianism.
Here are 5 great difficulties with such views of ethics. The first is that if they are valid, all philosophers ought to arrive at the same conclusions about what are the highest principles of moral law, and ought to apply them to ethical conduct in at least very similar ways. That they don't suggest that one needs to seek another source of absolutes than unaided human reason. The second is that abstractness of the concepts, meaning maraming ideas, hindi nagkakaisa or walang unity sa kanilang mga ideas. Kasi in the first place, they said that anyone who are trained with philosophical views must attain the same moral values. But in the second difficulties, it is abstract because hindi sila nagkakaisa. The third is that actual experience also forces one to question assumption of some absolutist that the sufficiently well-informed person cannot choose to do what is wrong. So there is another difficulties. On a most practical level, this assumption mocks the aching heart of every parent who has taught a child to do right only to have the child to grow up to do devil instead. So it is frustrating na morality, which is once you have attained or once you are sufficiently informed, you cannot choose to do what is wrong. But that is just not always the case. Because if you are a parent and you have taught your child of good conduct na anak, wag ganyan, wag ganito, pero ginawa pa rin niya, it only mocks the parent. No? The aching heart of a parent. Ba't nagaganito ang aking anak? I am sufficiently well informed. Or my anak is sufficiently well informed. Hindi naman ako nagkulang sa pag-aaruga o pag-a-advise, pero bakit nagawa pa rin niya piliin ang mali? So, yeah. The fourth is somewhat of a ring of arbitrariness to these philosophers' conclusions. It is easy to imagine coming to a different conclusion than that of Kant's, and indeed, modern philosophers no longer do place the categorical imperative at the top of their list. Meaning, modern na philosophers ngayon nagcho-choose na sila ng ibang philosophies or ibang moralities because hindi na fit sa kanilang situation ngayon or sa modern ngayon na society. Also, this would appear to be a fatal blow to the whole concept that sufficiently trained thinkers will always arrive at the same conclusions about moral philosophies. So, yun na naman, pabalik-balik lang na problema about this moral philosophy deduced by human logic or human reason. Fifth and finally, a Christian must argue that since all aspects of humankind, including the intellect, are fallen and flawed due to sin, we do not have the ability to reason perfectly and therefore could not come to correct conclusions about moral principles by unaided reasons. So from this book, maybe this author is a Christian. So in a Christian perspective, all in this earth is fallen due to sin. So therefore, you cannot logic or you cannot deduce a moral or a morality with good good outcome or unflawed because this earth is fallen due to sin in a Christian view. So moving on, chapter 3.4, the non-absolutist philosophers, morals are decided upon. So position number one of these non-absolute philosophers is that moral statements have little or no meaning. Moral statements have little or no meaning. The most extreme position here is occupied by those philosophers who assert that there is no such thing as absolute morality. That is, there are no universal norms on which choices of right, choices of wrong can be based. To this group called antinomians. So this group is standing or have a position that there is no morality or there is no right and wrong. Antinomianism, lawlessness. This group will assert that such words as good, right, moral, and ethical are essentially synonyms for some indefinable concept that is common to all. These terms but cannot be explained in simpler words. They conclude that such words are therefore meaningless in practical sense. So sa kanila, lahat ng good na aspects, right and moral, ethical, based on their position na well, no moral statements have little or no meaning. Para sa kanila, these concepts are non-existing or unapplicable in any sense. Some of these go farther, arguing that moral statements are absolutely meaning without meaning because they are not about physical objects and are not therefore verifiable through scientific methods. They also assert that moral statements are not logically deducible from non-moral premises. So, another sector of thinkers. These thinkers, variously known as logical positivists or materialists, hold that logical argument and scientific method applied to the material world are the only possible ways to know anything. So sa kanila, if ang isang bagay o ay isang statement ay hindi nasi-sense ng seeing, hearing or ng ating five senses or hindi pwede na ma-apply in a scientific method, hindi nila pinapansin or hindi nila rini-regard as may meaning. All else, including morals, is rejected as irrelevant. So yun yung word, it is irrelevant. Kung hindi mo ma-measure, hindi mo makita, hindi mo ma-weigh, hindi mo ma-experiment, it is irrelevant for them. For the logical positivist and or the materialist. What isn't knowable from the application of the five senses and the filtering of data through scientific method isn't knowable at all. So it isn't anything. So yun na nga. Despite taking this stand, some might still consider moral statements to be useful. Some, so ibang sector na naman to. Even if they are not verifiable. So some philosophers or some absolutists naman na umiksena ay hindi nila rini-regards kung ito ba ay verifiable. However, this usefulness would be entirely utilitarian and pragmatic. In this view, unethical behavior, if there's such a thing, is not absolutely wrong because wrong has no fixed meaning. So if you behave unethically, or you have caused damage to one person, or you have caused wrong to this person, no? It is without meaning. It is not wrong actually, because being wrong has no fixed meaning. Some antinomians may go even farther, holding that the terms right, wrong, good, and evil have neither meaning nor practical use. In this extreme view, all people have an absolute right to do whatever they personally conclude is proper, and there exists no authority that can legitimately restrict this right. So sa mga antinomians na ito, wala silang kinikilalang authority, meaning they can do whatever they want as long as they conclude it is proper. As long as feeling ko na tama ito, as long as feeling ko na ito ay nakakatulong, it is proper. Therefore, no one can restrict it from me, or no one can hinder me from doing this thing, because for me I conclude this is proper. So utilitarianism means ethical theory that determines right from wrong by focusing on outcomes, meaning the result. They focus on the result. And pragmatism is a philosophical movement that includes those claim that an ideology or proposition is true if it works satisfactorily, that the meaning of a proposition is to be found in practical consequences of accepting it, and that unpractical ideas are to be rejected. All people have the total personal responsibility to assess whatever situations they are in and to act accordingly. So, for example, to say an action is wrong is an unwarranted invasion of privacy. No person can legitimately participate in or even comment upon another's moral decisions. Herein lies the ultimate of freedom. There are no bounds, no chains, and no responsibilities. One is accountable only to oneself. This view is sometimes termed libertarianism. So meaning, walang pakialamanan. Kung anong gusto ko, akin yon. Kung may masasabi ka sa akin, it is invasion of privacy. Meaning, hindi mo ko pwedeng i-correct. Kung may nagawa man akong mali, hindi ka pwedeng makisatsat o makisabat kung ano ang dinicide ko na tama para sa akin, because this is the ultimate of freedom of this view in libertarianism. Some would moderate this view. So some would moderate this view, correctly observing that it does uphold at least one absolute meaning of the universal na moral, namely freedom. It is absolute. They advance this principle as the best contribution of the antinomians. Always act to maximize your own freedom and that of others. So this is the exact picture of this libertarianism, freedom. Don't tread on anyone, meaning wag kang makialam sa iba. Kung anong gusto nila, it is their will, it is their free will to. These difficulties lead to another variation on the antinomian theme. So maraming variation ang antinomian. Although morality is not absolute, it is nonetheless appropriate for the strongest in a given group to create and control society as they fit. In this view, rules of conduct are arbitrary rather than absolute. Those who are strong must arbitrate codes of behavior for the weak, enforcing such codes through the position of strength. It may be argued further that the evident superiority of some human beings gives them both the right and duty to be the arbiters of morals, meaning kung sino yung malakas, sila yung maghahari or sila yung magiging nasa taas. Kung ikaw ay mahinang nilalang or ikaw ay isang weak, nandun ka sa baba. These views are also compatible with those of the social Darwinists, who hold that human society and ethics are evolving in a process of natural selection that will guaranteeing the survival of strong people, strong ideas, strong ethics, as well as ensuring the unlimited demise of the weak. So, sa mga Darwinist naman, sa kanyang theory na natural selection, talagang ang malalakas lang ang magsusurvive. Mga those people who are strong, have great ideas, and strong ethics. So therefore, kung mahina ka, maiiwan ka talaga or meaning yung ang clan nyo is mawawala talaga. When the glue of moral consensus dissolves, the society also disintegrates. Freedom is not the same thing as license. So we know that the only thing na nag-hold up sa ating society is moral. If our society doesn't hold a moral value or set of rules and laws, for sure the society will disintegrate. Meaning walang na nag-glue sa kanila, walang holding force to which one is obeying or para saan ka pa umu-obey na wala namang set of rules, wala namang set of morals. So position 2 for the non-absolutist philosophers is that moral statements are general consensus. The philosophers who hold to this view accept that moral statements are meaningful. Moral statements are meaningful. They do not believe such expressions to be discoveries of universal principle. Therefore, they do not believe in absolute morals, but rather to be general decisions about behavior made with the ends in view which that conduct should produce. That is, they concentrate on the result of the actions rather than on the actions themselves. Actions that lead to desirable ends are defined to be good. Others are less so. Two actions leading to the same end are equal in moral content, even if they appear to be contradictory to themselves. So, action that leads to desirable ends, meaning kung ang result ng inyong action ay favorable sa inyong ginagawa or sa act, it is moral. For example, in this view, if the same result can be achieved by lying as by telling the truth, meaning kung makukuha mo ang gusto mo sa pagsisinungaling, kagaya ng pagsasabi mo ng totoo, itong dalawang to ay hindi na nagmamatter as long as the result is good. It is based all on the result. For example, sa math, kahit anong solution mo, basta you have arrived to the same answer, it is always correct. Ganyan ang kanilang morality. These are two main groups of philosophers who held this view: the hedonist and the utilitarians. So let's define what is hedonism. Hedonism is the ethical theory that pleasure, in the sense of the satisfaction of the desires, is the highest good and the proper aim of human life. So, pasarap-sarap lang yung mga nagsisik ng pleasure, no? Yung mga bibo-bibo lang, or what is good in life. That is their main aim. In utilitarianism, ethical theory that determines right from wrong by focusing on outcomes. So, it is based also in results. It is difficult to imagine how either can provide a basis for a kind of society. An association of people working and living together to fulfill common goals, because neither provides motivation for being specially concerned about other members of society. So these two morals are also in conflict in society, because as their characteristic in themselves sa dalawang theory na ito is only for self-interest. Ang kanilang good lamang ang nasa kanilang aim. They put their self first before anything else, because that is what they are, di ba? They seek for pleasure, proper aim, also in you focusing outcome. Perhaps hedonism's most serious shortcoming is its failure to account for the extreme situation that the majority in a society are sadists whose pleasure is maximized by inflicting pain. So, shortcoming in the hedonism ethics is not all wants good in life, or hindi lahat ng tao ay nag-aasam ng pleasure, hindi lahat ng tao ay nag-aasam ng kaligayahan. Ang ibang tao ay sadista, whose pleasure is maximized in inflicting pain. So, ang kanilang kaligayahan ay nagpapasakit ng ibang tao, or mas nagkakaroon sila ng pleasure if other people is suffering or ganyan. In stark contrast to hedonism, the Bible draws entirely the opposite conclusion about pleasing oneself by holding up the example of Christ. So, complete contrast to hedonism is in the Bible, which is the example of Christ. In Philippians 2:5, so this verse comes from this book. Only source is for in this book. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interest, but also to the interests of others. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who, being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself and became obedient to death, even the death on the cross. So it is a complete contrast. If hedonism seeks only for its self-interest, for only its pleasure, in the Bible, which is Christ, seeks for the interest of others. So do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit. The, the chief difficulty in this position seems to be that actions are regarded as having no intrinsic value in themselves, meaning walang meaning sa kanilang kaloob-looban. An attempt to save a drowning child would not, in this view, be a good act if it failed. If the would-be rescuer dies in the futile attempt, then far from being heroine, she is a fool. If she dies but the child is saved, then the act is at best neutral, depending on how one evaluates the relative worth of the two lives. Moreover, as with antinomianism, hedonism and utilitarianism both conflict with the view that there is a God who can and does dictate absolutes. Thus, a Christian, for instance, must decline to use such theories as a basis for judging actions. For these views is a complete contradictory to absolutes, meaning there is a given morality. Position 3. The only moral statement is the law of love. This position holds that the most desirable collective moral decision is to set forth a standard of love for persons, not things, as the single universal ethical imperative. So these philosophers has set their moral in the law of love, not on things, but on persons, love on persons. This is an attempt to capture a middle ground between antinomians and legalists. This is in between the antinomian, which has no rules at all, and the legalist, who has the rules for everything. The law of love is in between, and it seeks to do by setting forth a single intrinsic good, namely love. Single intrinsic good. All actions are relative to the principle of love. All your actions, all your act must be rooted to the principle of love. They have otherwise no positive or negative value of their own. The principle must be stated as follows: always do the loving thing. So instead of having the relative value of actions decided by the results, which is a utilitarianism, in the law of love, Actions are judged by the motivations behind them. It is judged by the motivations behind. No general rules for responses to particular situations can be given, because one cannot know in advance what a lovingly motivated response or action will be. Instead, one must wait to be in a situation to decide the most loving course of action. So therefore, hindi mo masasabi na loving siya na action if your motivation is not rooted in the law of love or in the action itself. It must have a reasonable motivation behind that action, because of its emphasis on doing the loving thing according to the situation or in the act. This moral philosophy is sometimes called situationism. This position is also relativistic, for any other ethical norms are valid only relative to one universal principle. Indeed, they are only valid if they happen to serve the law of love in a given situation. So it so the act is only valid if it serves the law of love. So whatever your actions may be or whatever your plans are, if the motivation or the act itself is not rooted in the law of love, in this love, it is not valid. It is not impossible to say that either lying or promise breaking is bad in itself. For the situationist might decide at some point that lying is the most loving thing in a particular circumstances and is therefore good. So therefore no results can undermine this act, because the situation will dictate and the motivation behind it if it serves the law of love. So it varies in particular circumstances. Does love get its meaning from the situations in which the principle is applied? Does love get its meaning in a situation? If so, situationists are faced with a circular definition, where love was supposed to be the judge of the situation. Hindi mo makukuha ang meaning ng love kung ibabase mo ito sa action. Because you must have a proper meaning of love before making the action, or you have the proper assumption of what love is to verify it in the action if it is loving or not, di ba? You must have this principal idea of love. How can the term gain its only meaning from the situations for which it is supposed to be the arbiter? Diba? It is supposed to be the arbiter. You cannot gain its meaning from the situation. It must have its own meaning before the action is done. Is love an emotion? And is one supposed to feel the loving in a particular situation? If so, love may not be a moral idea at all. For emotions differ with personality and over time. So if this law of love is based on emotion will fade over time. It differs with different personality, so it is not, no, hindi ito bagay na maging isang moral na idea. What is more, it has become common to advocate self-love as the highest or most common form of love. No? Self-love, mahalin mo muna ang sarili mo. Di ba yan ang ano ngayon? Bago ka magmahal ng iba, gano'n. Love situationism becomes indistinguishable from hedonism. Parang magka-classmate na itong dalawa. Hedonism at situationism, if situationism advocates this self-love, meaning they want to gain their own pleasure, they want to gain their own good for their self-interest. There is an even more serious problem, namely the decision to choose the particular single norm. The choice is supposedly not based on the discovery of any more universal principle than love, but is a collective decision of society. Dapat pangkalahatan. However, the motivation for this collective choice of love is unclear. Could not something else have been chosen? Say hatred. So, bakit nga ba love ang pinili? Hindi hatred, hindi hope, hindi faith, di ba? It is unclear. This possibility reveals that there must be some more fundamental principle that leads to the decision to choose love. So, what this sentence is meaning to say is that there must have been more options kung bakit napili itong moral na love. For example, in the Christian religion, love is an attribute of God that is revealed to human beings in the form of a gift to His Son to die for our sins. This is reciprocated by believers in Him by a loving God, and thereby love between human beings is also legitimized. So there is a definition of love. There is a source. Love your neighbor as yourself. It is not the most comprehensive statement of this, but hold others in higher regard than yourselves. Hindi lang para sa'yo, but para rin sa kabubuti ng iba. In this way, biblical agape or selfless love has a context, no? Has a context and is part of a hierarchy of activity in which love for God, not simply love itself, as the top of the pyramid. So in the context of the Christian religion, love is in the top because of the scripture, love yourself, love your neighbor as yourself. Rather, it is collective, hindi lang for your own, hindi hindi for self-interest only. Christians also have little choice but to reject this moral theory because they hold that humankind is fallen, and therefore that feelings of love are unreliable at best and twisted at its worst because it is fallen. Moreover, they hold that God, who defines what is good, does not change, and that therefore moral principles, while they might have to be adapted and to apply to a given situation, transcends all human experiences and situation. Biblical morality has a universality that goes beyond one's feelings of love at the time of the individual act. Meaning, in a Christian religion, the act of love is not given, will not have its definition in act themselves or the motivation or the result, because it has its definition that love, God is love and it is good, and it does not change over time or in any situation.
Social contract theory. Social contract theory says that people live together in society in accordance with an agreement that establishes moral and political rules of behavior. Some people believe that if we live according to a social contract, we can live morally by our own choice, and not because a divine being requires it. Over the centuries, philosophers as far back as Socrates have tried to describe the ideal social contract, and to explain how existing social contracts have evolved. Philosopher Stuart Rachel suggests that morality is simply the set of rules governing behavior that rational people accept on the condition that others accept them too. Social contracts can be explicit, such as laws, or implicit, such as raising one's hand in class to speak. The U.S. Constitution is often cited as an explicit example of part of America's social contract. It sets out what the government can and cannot do. People who choose to live in America agree to be governed by the moral and political obligations outlined in the Constitution's social contract. Indeed, regardless of whether social contracts are explicit or implicit, they provide a valuable framework for harmony in society.
Slippery slope arguments say that we shouldn't do something, call it A, because A will lead to B and B will lead to C and so on, until we end up with something bad. For example, someone might argue against requiring additional background checks for gun owners because they'll say, well, if we allow that, then the government will want to restrict the type of guns and then the number of guns, and before you know it, the freedom to own a gun will be completely taken away. Or to take an example that I'm quite familiar with, people used to argue against same-sex marriage by saying that same-sex marriage would lead to polygamy and then incest, bestiality. People would just marry their kitchen appliances or something.
Happy anniversary, darling.
The general idea is that adopting this policy will send us down a slippery slope, or open a can of worms or a Pandora's box, give them an inch and they'll take a mile. There are different ways of saying the same thing, but they share the idea that the initial step will send us down a path to something bad. Such claims depend upon certain empirical assumptions. They assume connections between A and B, B and C, and so on. And not all such claims are created equal. For instance, we've had same-sex marriage in the United States for a number of years, but it hasn't led to a great wave of support for polygamy, much less to people marrying their cats or their toasters. On the other hand, for example, there's reliable evidence that if we raise the speed limit from 55 to 65, people will be more likely to drive 75. In other words, some slopes are actually slippery. And there's the question about whether the alleged result is actually a bad thing. Maybe 75 is an unsafe rate of speed on this particular highway. Maybe not. Maybe polygamy has bad social consequences. Maybe not. We can debate these things. The point is, if you're going to make a slippery slope argument, be prepared to answer the following two questions. First, what's the evidence for the alleged slippage? And second, what's so bad about the bottom of the slope?